Welcome. This week, or this lesson, we'll be looking at the history of Spain. A lot of times, when it comes to our history, particularly, let's say about 50, 60 years ago, we really kind of highlighted our Spanish side because we wanted to have that connection with Europe. However, this lesson does not do that. The purpose of me teaching about the history of Spain is a little bit twofold. Number one, yes, we are connected to Spain, whether we like it or not. We are. It is part of who we are as Mexican Americans. But really, the key reason that I want to highlight about Spain is the concept of mestizaje, how mixed Spain is, even though they might perceive themselves as European or even as white. When you look at the history of Spain, you see that it's much more complicated, and there's quite a few different groups living there that make it complicated, particularly when you compare it to a place like France or England or Germany. So this lesson really focuses on not only those ideas, but also the concept of race. Where does the concept of race come from, right? It's not something that Native Americans invented. It's something that comes from Europe. So we'll briefly touch on that too. All right, so we'll be looking at the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain, and this idea called La Reconquista. So before we begin getting into the medieval period, I want to touch a little bit about its ancient history because, as I mentioned a second ago, Spain has a lot of different groups of people living there. So the Greeks had colonized it for a while. They established ports there where they traded between Greece and Spain. A lot of kind of goods came back and forth during this region. You had the Basques, who tend to live up in the like the northern part of Spain, like the eastern north part. They're still having a fight for independence. You have these kind of tribal groups called the Celts, and then you also have the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are people who lived in the like in northern Africa, and again, because of their proximity to Spain, they were constantly traveling there and controlled it for a short period of time. It's actually the Romans who come in and take it from the Phoenicians, right, from Carthage. And you have these wars. They're called the Punic Wars. They have a few of them that are fought in Spain, along with other places. And we see this kind of constant battle for this territory. At this time, there is no concept of Spain. They didn't think of themselves as a collective group of people, but rather as a group of people that are colonized. So Spain has, I won't say always, but has gone through a long history of colonization by different groups. But it's a very mixed group, right? It's a very diverse group, as you could kind of see here. When the Romans began to take it over in about the year 133 before Christ, or before Common Era, they come in, the Romans come in, and they begin to try to Romanize it, right? So we talk about words like Americanization, here we see how the Romans try to Romanize them, make the people who lived in Spain into Roman citizens. And we see this in many different ways. One of the best ways that we see is that if you know anything about Roman history, is that when they conquered you, it could be a bit of a plus because they brought in basically Rome to your locality. So this is a town in Spain by Madrid called Segovia. I went there once. And you see this great monument right here, right? And this is an aqueduct, right? It carries water from the mountains to the city so the city can grow. And it's actually still there. It's kind of cool to just, check out. And this is the great thing about the Romans, is that when they came in to conquer you, they brought in their architecture. Their city planning was really great because it's all perpendicular, like the way Phoenix is kind of laid out, which makes it really great for businesses. And they brought in their culture, and they brought in their language, right? So we see how Spanish derives from Latin, right? And it's a very beautiful language. And this lasted a good maybe about 500 years of Roman rule of this area. But then by about 476, current era, so after Christ, I guess people would say, the Roman Empire begins to fall. This happens in Rome in 476. This group of people called the Visigoths go into Rome and they conquer it, they take it over, and then they slowly but surely begin to move out of Rome, and the Visigoths end up in Spain. So, the Visigoths came from, I think they suppose they came from like the German area, or if not Russia. They migrated into the Roman Empire. The Romans hired them to be warriors. Eventually, they wanted to be Roman too, so they took over Rome, and then slowly but surely they kind of migrated west into Spain. And they were known as barbarics. The Romans used to call anybody who didn't speak Latin or Greek barbarians. To them, when people spoke, it sounded like bar. So that's why that's where the word comes from, barbarian. And anyways, as the Visigoths begin to take over these different regions, in particular Spain, they begin to convert into Christianity. Now, at this time, they convert into Arianism. So I won't dig too deep into this, but I just want you to know that they practice a form of Christianity that's very different from Catholicism. So today we think of Spain as very Catholic. At this particular moment, around the 5th, 6th century, they practice this concept called Arianism. And this will kind of shape its history from this point forward. They rule for a couple hundred years, but then another group comes in and they begin to take over. And their capital is in this town called Toledo. It's like I think an hour away from Segovia. And Toledo becomes almost like the capital of Spain. It's a very important city, along with Granada. And the Moors and the Christians were always fighting for it. So by 711, you have a new group come in. So earlier I mentioned all these other different people, right, Greeks and so forth, kind of living in Spain. Well, again, there's a long history, but more people come in, if you can believe it, right? Talk about migration. The Moors come in and they begin to take over. About 711, this leader, Sassad, comes in and he transforms Spain into really the center of Europe. Typically when you teach Western Civ, you don't talk about Spain, but it's such a kind of great history because we don't talk about it because the Moors kind of control it. We tend to focus mostly on kind of white European type history. And the Moors, who are Muslims at this time, right? The Muslims come from Northern Africa. They cross into Spain and they actually go all the way up to France, where they fight Charles Martel, and they end up losing. But that's where it kind of stops. So the Muslims controlled everything we know as Spain today, along with Portugal, but also a little bit of France. But you can imagine how the Moors would transform this area. They bring in, for about 700 years, and it's different groups of Moors. It's not just the same group controlling this territory. But the Moors, they bring in some, kind of great thinkers. They bring in this man named, or they don't bring him in, but he lives in Spain. His name is Averos. And it's known during this period as the golden age of Europe and even of Spain because, they're doing such kind of great work. It's the Moors who preserve this great Greek philosopher named Aristotle. So if you know anything about history, Aristotle is very key to the development of Western philosophy. And he had been lost for generations. But it's the Moors who are able to get a copy and they translate it and they bring it to Spain. And from Spain, it goes to the rest of Europe. And it kind of, Western civilization kind of develops from there. But a lot of it has to do in thanks part to the Muslims. In addition, you have Jewish and Christian people kind of coexisting under the reign of Muslims. Muslims, for the most part, they would let you practice your religion, but you just had to pay a higher tax, which is something unheard of almost at this time, right? A lot of times there was a lot of, particularly with Christians, if Christians took over land, they would force conversion on everybody. Here, we see that they allow people to practice their own faith, and they actually got along fairly well. Again, relatively well. Where we even see Christians, they were called Mozarabes. And what you see happening there is that Christians would assimilate into Muslim culture, right, into the Moorish culture, which is always a bit of a, just kind of interesting because we always assume it's the other way around, right? Everybody's trying to appease the Christians, and here's a great example where Christians are becoming Muslims. Now, things begin to change by the 12th century. You begin to see the Christians kind of fight against different groups. One of them being the Muslims. It's not, when we use the word like La Reconquista, it's very kind of problematic. Partly because it's not like Moors against Christians. I think by the 10th century, a new group of Moors come in, and these are a little bit more fundamentalist Moors. I think they're called the Almohads, and they actually hate how the old Moors treated Christians and Jewish people. So they came in and they did like book burnings and things like that, because they hated the way their predecessors coexisted with these people. So these new Moors were a little bit more fundamentalist, and they got in conflicts with different Christians, and everybody's kind of fighting for land anyways. So it is Pelayo who kind of starts this notion of what's called La Reconquista. It's not a big issue at this particular moment. We're talking about the 11th century here, but it becomes bigger, particularly after Alfonso VIII. And he begins to push out the Moors from Toledo into Granada, which is the southern part of Spain. Toledo is in the center. It's, like I said, an hour away from Segovia, from Madrid, really. And they, there you really begin to see the birth of what we call La Reconquista. The church basically sanctions this movement that allows Christians to kill Muslims, or to force conversion. But even during the rule of Alfonso the Eighth, you still see a lot of coalitions, but also relationships building between Moors and Christians. Toledo is like this great center of education at this time, where all these groups are studying together, are learning together. If I was in Toledo too, and I remember there you have like Jewish temples they got converted to Christian temples or Christian churches by the end of the Reconquista. But you have like mosques, Christian churches, and Jewish temples kind of coexisting, even under the rule of Spanish kings. But La Reconquista kind of really begins to take off by this period. And by 1492, we begin to see the Moors essentially expelled from Spain. They're pushed onto Granada. They got one last stronghold. Los Reyes Católicos, which is Isabel and Ferdinand, they kind of merged their kingdom together, and they finish them off. They turn over the keys to the Christian rulers, and the Muslims cease to exist. But it's what's kind of interesting here you see a picture of the Reyes Católicos. They actually, the Christian kings really respected Moorish culture, so much so that Isabella is actually buried in Granada, in the old fortress of the Muslims. To them, they felt like that was their home, and a lot of it had to do because they enjoyed, this Moorish culture. So it's quite interesting that you have this Reconquista to kind of cleanse the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims, yet they have a deep respect for that culture. It's like a racist hating Mexicans, but saying I love Mexican food, and always eating tacos and things like that. So, unfortunately, the Jewish people face the same fate. Anybody who didn't convert were forced to the what's it called, Inquisition. And if they were seen as though the conversion was not genuine, they would be killed. So La Reconquista and this event really begins to shape this idea of race. It went from being a religious conflict to some extent, particularly things like the Crusades, which this eventually becomes like a crusade, to a racial conflict where the Europeans, particularly the Castilians, begin to see themselves as superior to Jewish people and Moorish people, and they begin to label them, kind of noting that it's something in their blood, right? Kind of associating religion and blood as going hand in hand, and we know that's not true, right? You can easily convert to another religion without changing your blood. So this is kind of like the beginning where race and racism begins. So what do we learn here? I know it's a kind of quick short lecture about Spain. I just want to highlight some kind of certain points. We see that Spain has this kind of long history of conquest, and it kind of shapes its history. Everything from the Greeks to the Romans to the Castilians have conquered this territory, and this shapes the way many of these people think of the groups that they're conquering. That's why the concept of race comes about. We find that when the Moors controlled Spain, it was a very diverse place. It was, in the context of European history and medieval history, it was probably the most accepting place. I mean, it wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a place that allowed different groups to come together. I mean, Jewish scholars and Muslim scholars studying together. It's almost unheard of today. Yet we wouldn't believe that happening back then, and they did. Some great research came out of this place that eventually kind of filters its way to the rest of Europe. Things like even Arabic numbers, right? I mean, kind of work their way into the rest of Europe. Imagine trying to use Roman numerals. That's really complicated. Things like paper. Before, they used to have scrolls and used to use like some kind of leather, like sheepskin, to write things on. Really hard to bound. It's the Moors who bring in paper from China into Spain and then to the rest of Europe. And there's all this kind of great scientific work being done during this period. So when the Moors controlled Spain, it was a bit of a golden age, as I said earlier, to live there. Great scientific work too, like medical work too. And then lastly, the last point that I try to highlight with La Reconquista is this notion that the Spanish create this notion of the other. Imagine being alive during the end of La Reconquista. Your people and your history is full of war for at least 700 years. Give and take here and there. But all of a sudden, in 1492, you're asked to stop fighting, right? What do you do with yourself? All you know is how to fight. All you know is that these people have taken over what you think is rightfully yours, and now you have to kick them off. But now there's no one to fight. What does that do to your psyche? And this really kind of shapes the Spanish mentality when they begin to travel out of Spain into other parts of Europe, all right? So those who are not Christian become viewed as the other. You have things that are called like even crypto-Jews, Jewish people who say that they're Christian, but still practice their faith in their home. a lot of times the way they built their homes in southern Spain during this time is that they put a door up front. It's mostly just this big massive barricade where people can't look inside, because inside you would still practice your faith, and you didn't want people to see you doing that, because then you could be turned in if you were Jewish or Moors or Muslim. So it was very kind of cloak and dagger. You had to hide your faith, but when you went out in public, you would say that you were Christian, or you would obviously know the Bible, because you don't want to get killed. So this is the beginning where kind of racial ideas begin to develop in the world history. All right, so we'll stop it there. The next lesson will be looking at the other side, at Mexico.